Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a legal case that seems simple on the surface, a clothing store sale, but believe me, it led to a huge ruling that still affects businesses all over Europe. So that's the big question, right? It sounds a little odd, I know, but the answer to this question actually uncovers this really important rule. It's a rule that's all about protecting businesses, especially small ones, when they're going through a big change, like a sale. All right, let's get into it.
So let's set the scene. Our story kicks off in Luxembourg, and it's all about a little clothing boutique, a ready-to-wear shop called Zita Modes. Okay, so back in 1996, Zita Modes decides to sell the business, and the buyer? A perfumery called Milady. Now, from Zita Modes' perspective, this was a simple transfer of the business. They figured it wasn't subject to value-added tax, VAT. But the Luxembourg tax authorities saw things very differently. They sent Zita Modes a surprise bill saying, nope, this deal doesn't qualify for that special tax break.
And their argument was pretty straightforward, at least from their point of view. They said, hold on, a perfumery can't just take over a clothing store. They insisted that the new owner had to run the exact same kind of business. And not only that, they needed to have the official government license for it. So right there, you've got the makings of a huge legal fight.
Now, to really get what this is all about, we got to take a step back and look at the rulebook. Specifically, we need to look at this one key piece of EU law, a rule that was actually created to make these kinds of sales a lot simpler.
So, first things first, a super quick refresher on VAT. You probably know this, but it's a tax on stuff, goods and services that businesses collect on behalf of the government. Normally, if a business sells off a bunch of its assets, that sale gets hit with VAT. But, and this is a big but, there's a really important exception to that.
And that brings us right to the heart of the matter. It's called the no supply rule. It's basically an option in EU law that lets countries treat the sale of a whole business as if no supply of goods ever happened, for tax purposes anyway. And if there's no supply, there's no VAT bill. Simple as that. And you can see exactly why this rule is so smart. It's all about making it easier to sell a business, to grease the wheels of commerce. It stops the new owner from getting slammed with this massive, maybe even business-killing tax bill on day one. The whole point is to keep the cash in the business where it's needed, not locked up in some tax office waiting for a refund. So this case got so messy that the local court in Luxembourg basically threw up its hands and said, we're not sure how to rule on this. So what did they do? They kicked it upstairs. They sent the whole problem, framed as a series of questions, to the highest court in the EU, the European Court of Justice. And the question they asked was super direct. They basically said, hey, about this no supply rule, does it apply whenever a whole business is sold to someone no matter what that person plans to do with it? Or are there other conditions we need to think about? Are there strings attached?
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. This is the core of the whole disagreement. On one side, you've got the tax guys with their really narrow, really restrictive take on the rule. And on the other side, you have what ended up being the court's view, which was way broader and frankly a lot more practical.
All right, so let's get to the verdict. The European Court of Justice weighed in, and their decision brought some serious clarity. And not just for our little clothing store, but for businesses all across the European Union.
So the court came back with this really clear two-punch answer. First, they said yes, the rule applies when you transfer a whole business, or even just an independent part of one. And then, crucially, they said that a country, like Luxembourg, can't just go and make up its own extra rules, like insisting the new owner has a specific license.
The court also went out of its way to define what totality of assets really means. And it's not just, selling off your old computers and leftover stock. It has to be a real, functioning business unit, something that can actually stand on its own 2 feet and operate as a business. Think of it like selling a whole car, not just the tires and the steering wheel.
Okay, so let's boil it down. The absolute key takeaway is this. The buyer has to actually intend to run a business with what they bought. They can't just be an asset stripper who's going to sell everything off for parts. But, and this was the knockout blow for the tax authorities' argument, the buyer does not have to run the exact same business. That was the game changer.
So you might be thinking, okay, that's an interesting story, but why should I care about a 2 decades old case about a clothing shop in Luxembourg? Well, because the logic behind this ruling is absolutely fundamental to how we think about business transfers even today. I mean, listen to what the court itself said. The whole point of the rule is to facilitate transfers. It's about simplifying things, making them smoother, and preventing a new business from getting crushed by a huge tax bill before it even gets started. It's just common sense, really. Just think about it for a second. Without this rule,
The new owner would have to find a ton of cash to pay the VAT on the entire purchase, right up front. Yeah, they could probably claim it back from the government later, but in those first critical months, that's a massive, massive cash flow problem. The no supply rule basically prevents that financial trap from ever springing.
Ultimately, the Zita Modes case is just a perfect example of how good, sensible law should help business not get in its way. It's a win for common sense over rigid bureaucracy. And that really leaves us with a big question to chew on. Where else are businesses today getting tied up in red tape? And what can we do to simplify things so they can actually grow and thrive?